Hello, happy Friday. This is Jen Lee here with my other co-host, David Litton and Rakesh Gupta, and our guest presenter, Pete Fife. So welcome to the 12th Automation Hour session. And it would help if it moved. Okay. All right. So for those new joining us, we try and meet every other Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. However, we do have some scheduling changes for March. So for upcoming March, we have Doug Ayers. He will be our two-time presenter for Automation Hour on the 10th. We had originally scheduled him for 3/3 and had to move him back for scheduling conflicts. Then on 3/17, we have Stuart, who will be presenting nonprofit process automation use cases. And then on the 24th, we'll have Martin, and that was rescheduled from 3/31 since there was a conflict with Southeast Dreamin'. So in the month of March, we will be reaching out and scheduling people for the April, May, and June webinar sessions. So if you're interested in presenting a cool idea, do follow the link that's in the presentation and submit your idea. We're also, so you know, looking for people who are interested in presenting beginner-level process automation use cases. We've heard some feedback from the people who are attending. While we've been presenting more immediate and advanced use cases, there are some beginner folks out there. So feel free to submit your ideas accordingly. And also I want to give a shout out to those out there in the audience who are women in tech. We would like to have you represent as well. So logistics, all lines are muted, so use the chat function to ask questions and post the session. Continue to ask your questions on the success community, and we will be communicating the recording after the session on social media as well as the success community and our website. So the resources are there. Salesforce Automation Hour is our success community. Our website is automationhour.com, and we post our recordings. You can follow the bit.ly/Automation Hour YouTube. So we're going to give a shout out to our sponsor, Concrete.io. Thank you for sponsoring our webinar series. And here are your awesome co-hosts, Rakesh, David, and I. And this was taken from Dreamforce 16. But we will be appearing at Southeast Dreamin'. We'll be presenting introduction sessions on Flow as well as Process Builder. So if you're out there at Southeast Dreamin', Atlanta, Georgia, March 30th to the 31st, stop by and say hi. And with that, I am going to hand it over to our guest speaker, Pete.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I am happy to be here. So we're going to get the presenter control changed over here so I can start sharing my screen in a minute. All right. All right, so real quick, just to be sure that my screen is presenting, can I get a, yes, you can see my picture up on with my little.
Yes, I can see your picture.
Perfect. Excellent. So, because that's really what's important is being able to see my picture. So, as I said, so I've been working on the platform for 14 years. So back in 2003 is when I first started. I originally started the Salesforce user community back in 2003 as well on the Yahoo boards, and I've been part of the community ever since then. I was one of the first of 500 to be certified. I was awarded, before the MVP program came out, a customer hero in 2008. And I do consider myself a button-click developer because I do think that what we're doing in changing and making an application run and do things differently. That is developer work. And I am currently studying towards my certified technical architect. I currently have attained my application architect last month. So I'm actually on my way. I'm halfway there. So I'm going to success or destination success next month. So if you're going to go there, please look me up. I am the guy in the normal Where's Waldo scarf. So that is my little signature in Dreamforce. I go by Fife Dog up on the community board as well. So that's a little bit about me. And what we're going to be doing today is hopefully I'm going to take some time and a little step back, and we're going to do a deep dive into loops and into the flow. And we're going to kind of break this down because I really want to be able to help. This was a very difficult topic for me to wrap my head around of actually what is a loop, how does it work. Theoretically, we know what it is, but I want to actually break it down, right? So this really is a intermediate advanced type area. So when you start getting into this, there is some things that we're getting into this code cliff area of where you're right on the precipice of this cliff, and the next step that you do is on apex. So this does take some skill, and it's a little different thinking, okay? We have to work with collections or these lists, right? Think of it as a big Excel spreadsheet, right? You have a collection or a list of items or records that you need to process and do something with one at a time. You have to start thinking about variables. There's these things that within a programming space like fields, you have to create and track. Well, one of the things that we have to think of, we're working with items that aren't in the database yet. So they're in memory, okay? Custom logic. There is nothing that guides us through like the process builder, right? Okay, what's the node? What's the object you want to work on? Okay, what's the first step you want to do? What's your criteria? What's your actions, right? This is a blank canvas, okay? It gives us these little elements we can drag and drop, but the order matters, right? So we really have to kind of plan out and think about logic, right? It is your logic that you want to do. We have to think about this CRUD operations. And CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. There's other words that you'll hear a lot called DML statements. And DML just means data manipulation language. Okay, so that's really the CUD. You know, kind of think of a cow, right? You have your create, updates, and deletes, right? Those are when you're actually doing something to the records themselves. And Salesforce has those API limits. That's part of something that you're going to have to think about. One of the best practices that I know I'm a little nervous because Parker Edelman's here, and you know he did a great job on his presentation. But the best practice, of course, is you don't do any type of CUD statements or DML statements in your loops, okay? Because you're going to eat up those limits pretty quick. So those are the things you're going to have to think of. Assignments of data, what does that actually mean, right? You're taking data and parts of data, and we're changing that data, okay? We're basically setting values, okay? There are debug statements. You have logic. Well, how do you track and how do you know at what process or what step this value is at? My variable is this before it comes into my assignment. I want to be sure my variable is set to this when it comes out. So you're going to have to think about that. We'll take a look at that. Naming convention. This is when I first started doing loops and starting to actually just doing flow a year and a half ago, getting my hands on it. I had no naming convention, which is standard. But since then, I've really kind of come out about my own naming convention. And if you've noted or if you've seen, I've posted actually a loop cheat sheet, which I'll be able to present to you guys afterwards. It is basically my little encapsulation of what is the best naming conventions to kind of go through and do, and how to name your variables, how to name your S objects, how to name your collections. It kind of just gives a little bit better processing, and you're able to speed up when you're looking for things and assigning things. So that's something that I would highly encourage you to do. So we're going to take a look at the 5 characteristics of your personalities, right? Yeah, no. Really want to take a look at the loops, right? Before, like, I'm considered slow. I'm not really that quick on the wit. But I thought this element that Salesforce did in, this loop element, okay? Step number 2 here, that's what a loop was, right? And I was like, okay, how do I use this thing, right? And what does it do? Well, really about a loop, it's really 5 different characteristics, right? 1 is your fast lookup. which is basically your Excel spreadsheet. You have to get your collection of stuff first. That's the first thing you do. And you have to save it to a collection object. And we'll take a look at that. Secondly, there's this loop element, okay? And this one loop element in step 2 is really about taking your first object, your first record out of that list and doing something with it. That's all that loop does. It takes that top element off and it goes, great, we're going to take a loop at it, we're going to do something with it, and we're going to, come back to it and repeat, okay? The third characteristic is an assignment. So this is where in a loop can start getting, you'll see a lot of different like decisions, or there's a lot of examples out there about how people do loops. There's a decision point, there could be additional processing, but really it's going to be, you're going to do something with this one record, right? You can be creating or modifying, resetting fields, updating fields. This part is really where you're going to do your reassignment and data manipulation of, and this again is just in memory. We haven't done anything to the actual data yet, all in memory. The fourth characteristic is now you're going to be doing this new collection. So you've done something with the record, and now we're going to have to save it to a new collection, right? So you have your original spreadsheet, you change the data, and we have to have a new spreadsheet to capture that data. And we'll do something later, because in step 5 is really going to be when you commit it, right? So this is what we'll get into of how you are properly able to write things all in one statement and what we call bulkification, okay? So those are the characteristics that we're going to look at. Now we're going to take a look at what user story that we're actually going to walk through and kind of do this. Now, as I'm going through this process, please feel free to start asking your questions in the chat. So I want this to be more interactive. I want to be able to ensure that it can answer a question when you have it, right? So feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and then we'll have a monitoring, we'll have a breakpoint, and I'll be able to answer those as we go. So be sure just to go ahead, if you have a question, go ahead and ask it in the chat window. So the story is this. So we have a user called a hiker, right? And they want to create a goal. So they want to track their progress towards my certification, right? So the whole thing is, like a certification, I want to get certified as a technical architect. Well, I want to track that journey. So I want to create my own goal. I have specific prerequisites. So when I create my goal, the system should copy all the prerequisites from the standard Sherpa goal and make them related to my milestones. This little graph down here is kind of the model, right? So we have an object called a Sherpa goal, which is i.e. a certification. And then we have a list of all the prerequisites that are needed, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the Sherpa goal, find the prerequisites, and copy them over to a milestone listed under the My Goal. So let's go ahead and take a look at that actually in Salesforce, right? So here's my Salesforce object. This is my Sherpa goal. I am trying to attain my application architect, okay? And that requires the platform 1, sharing and visibility, app designer or app builder, and data management, okay? So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to come over here to my goal. We're going to actually want to have those items be populated down here in the milestone, okay? So we're going to walk through that. So that's kind of our story, and that's what we're going to stick to. Okay, so the first part, right, the first characteristic, okay? So we're going to keep the little data model up here so you can keep that fresh in your mind of what we're trying to do. The fast lookup, okay? This again is the collection, right? So we get it, and we're going to have to say, what do we want to capture? What is that spreadsheet? What is that? What are those records that we want to do something with? So the name, I like to do my naming as verbs, especially in this get prerequisites, right? So all my lookups and that kind of deal is a verb, get, right? Because we're trying to get that. The unique name, I always like to do FST for my fast lookups because there is the other standard object lookups that would just say get, but fast is different and I like to use those. So that's kind of a part of a naming convention that I like. Here is where we identify, just like in a workflow rule, you identify the object that you're trying to do, right? So we identify it, the prerequisite, okay? So that's our list of items here, okay? And what the field that we're going to look at is the parent certification equals var Sherpa goal. So what I'm doing is, on my related record of my goal, there's an input. So when we trigger this value, I'm taking, when we create a goal, it's related to a Sherpa goal. So what I'm going to do is this lookup now goes, all right, find all the prerequisites that, let me go back to my prerequisites. All right, so if we take a look at this one, I'm going to look at all the prerequisites with my parent certification equaling my goal, my Sherpa goal, right, related here. Okay, so that's the where clause. That's what the list that I'm going to build, and that's going to give me my related prerequisites. Now down below, this is where we have the variable, okay? So naming convention, COL. I like to just name the first 3 letters of what the object is. If it's a collection, an S object, SOB, collection, SOL, a standard label field variable, VAR, for variable. So we have to have a collection because a collection is what a loop has to work off of. So you always have 2 options, but when we deal with loops, you always have to do a collection. Okay? So, second element. The second element is really important, this loop object. What does this loop object actually do? This inspects each record of the collection one at a time, right? So if we take a look at my loop, I name it as loop prerequisites, right? I'm going to loop through those. I name it as LOO. It's just my naming convention. Now, previously, this is where. So we want to loop through a collection. This is the collection that we just did in our first step. We can adjust the ascending order, right? So if you want to, ascending or descending, doesn't really matter. And then we have, well, what is this thing? This was the hardest thing for me to get my brain wrapped around. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time here. So hopefully this will make sense with you too. We need one object, right? So we have a list of collection here, but within our loop, we're working with one specific record, okay? So, and that's what this loop element is doing. It's saying, okay, when I go through my list of stuff, I need this one record to work on, right? And we're going to work with this one record throughout our process. So that's why, so this is a normal S object, and I don't name it as an SOB just for the fact that since it's specific to my loop, I don't ever want to see it or don't ever want to use it outside of that loop. So what I do is I actually call it, you know, loop, LOO, but then I also do temp and then the object name. That helps me just kind of designate, okay, this one record, this one S object is only used for in my loops, right? So I never get confused with it. I never try to use it somewhere else, which I've done before, and it has caused many, many headaches. So that's what we're doing. This loop says, give me the list, and then give me a variable that I'm going to use and override every time I come back. All right, so I want to pause right here. Hopefully there's no questions. I don't think I see anything else up here, so that's good. Now, let's take a look at the assignment. So now we have our one record that we're going to now work on, okay? It's been set to my loop temp, okay? Assignments. Assignments now are all about what we want to do with the data, right? So we now want to do, in our story, we're going to copy this value and make a copy of it over into our new object, right? So that's what we're going to do. That's this example. You can always do updates, right? So you might be able to work on the same record, right? So you're going to keep the same record. Again, this is kind of that blank logic canvas, right? So whatever the business or the story is, that's what you're going to do. So my assignment, again, I like to use a verb. I say set vars, right? So assignment 1 is like, great, I'm going to set some variables now. My unique name is ASG. This is where I break my mold of using the first 3 because Otherwise, I'm going to have a lot of asses in my code, and I don't necessarily want to do that. So I just do ASG for my naming standard convention. Here is where I take my current object, okay? So I have my milestone prerequisites, and I'm going to equal it to my temp loop. So this is where I'm going to take, this is my new milestone, right? So I have a new object that I've created that I'm going to store something in. So I want to have it equal to my record, right? So this record, my ID is going to come over into this because I have a link, right? I have a lookup. So every milestone has a lookup, and we'll take a look at that. Let's bring that over here so we can kind of see what this data model looks like. Okay. So within the milestone details, this is what I have. Okay. And so we're going to have some assignments going on. And this goal, right? So this is the goal that I have related. So that's my top level goal. Okay. And I have to set, because that's how it started. Anytime my milestone is created, so I'm always going to have this one, all my milestones are going to relate. So that's just a standard variable. When I run this, I fire it from a process builder, and on create of a milestone, when it has a Sherpa goal, I have this record ID, and that's when I'm going to go grab everything. So I'm just passing in, every milestone is going to have the same goal, right? So I just basically set it to my current goal, and it gets set the same. So we create our milestone object, we create the link for the prerequisite ID, and everything gets set in there. So now I've actually created my milestone in memory, and we're good. So now let's take a look at what has been next. So the second assignment. So now we've done something, and we've actually created this record in memory, okay? So how do we create it and actually get it ready for saving to the database? Now, when I first started, I did a very bad habit. It was like, I was like, okay, great. I have this assignment now. Now I want to, save it to the database, right? And a lot of people probably do, but they put a, create milestone here, which is bad because we're going to hit that limit, right? So if you have multiple of these, you're going to hit a limit very quickly, and it's not what's called bulkify. What we want to do is we need to save it now to a new spreadsheet, to a new collection, a new list. So this is where I go assigning to new milestone collection. So we have a new collection. So we think of, we have our list over here. Now we're going to have another list over here, and that's what we've done. So there is a new milestone or a new collection, COL, and I say new milestone because I want to, again, be sure that this one specific list is always what I use for when I create this new milestone, right? Because I'm going to probably process other milestones later on or maybe in the same flow, and I'm going to have a different collection for that, which is great, but at least I know that this one is my new one because this is going to be used very shortly. And we do an add, and we do an add of milestones. So what we're doing is we're taking this whole record, right? This whole record, all the fields in it, and just assigning it to this collection. And that's how we do add, okay? So we're just doing one record and adding it to the collection, right? So we're kind of building it back up. So when the loop comes down, we tear it off. We look at one at a time, and we build this one back up. So one collection to a new collection. That was one of the other hardest things that I had to understand was I'm creating a loop variable. I'm creating a temporary S-object variable. I'm creating a collection list for my first one, and I'm creating a second collection list to save it. So
Pete, we do have a question. Sorry.
Yes.
I'll jump in with a question. So Lori is asking, I don't see where you are mapping or populating other fields into the new milestone.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Yeah, let me go back to that one. So good eyes, Miss Eagle Eyes over there. So I am not populating other data. If I wanted to, I would, right? So I would be grabbing all my prerequisite milestones because I was telling the people before I am a late bloomer and I tend to do things last minute. So I did the bare minimums here to show this example. So I am not populating user goal, journey record, creation. Let's open up this one. the cost, right? So all these kind of things over here are actually in my prerequisite or in my top level. I would be assigning all those assignments here. So so in this first assignment is where you do all your assignments of all the data in all the fields you want to save when you create the new record. So that is absolutely correct. Good eagle eyes. So hopefully that makes sense. Anything else? I don't think anything else there. All right, cool. So hopefully that answers that question. We'll move on. Thank you for catching that. And again, I'm trying to make it a little bit more general. So you are going to have to, hopefully the foundations of assignment 1, and you might do decisions, right? So again, there's a decision point. I think Salesforce has this as their loop kind of example, is where you want to assign like large account deals to this owner and then smaller account deals to that owner, right? So you have a decision before the assignment, right? And then you would have 2 assignments, right? Based on the decision of if it's a large account or not, you're going to copy the owner to be XYZ or be Rob, and the lower ones are going to be Kelly, right? So, but again, the foundational aspect, the understanding point that I want to try and bring across is you have always an element here to do your assignment and doing your assignment values and setting that new record, or or what the values you want.
Pete, we have 2 more questions that came in.
Yes.
So from Randy, so you create your memory variables in the first collection and then assign real values to the memory variables in the second collection?
That is correct. That is correct. So you get everything here, absolutely, from your first variable, and you go, I'm going to do it this way. And this might be hard-coded, right? So every time you create it, you actually might, in your assignment, it could be text. It says, I always want to create it, and you say, my lookup is going to equal XYZ every time. And you just type it into this value as normal text, and that's what is going to happen. And that is your, as you say, the real values in memory, correct. So it's you're writing records in memory saying, these are my values that I will save to the database later. Hopefully that answers that question.
And the next one is from Rachel. If you don't bulkify in the collection, are you at risk of going into an infinite loop if you have other automation on the same object?
No, you're not at risk of going into an infinite loop. You're at risk of hitting the API limits of DML statements. So it's not really, infinite loop will not happen. That's usually when you get a timeout. More than likely, if you have another, like let's say you call another subflow here within your loop that's doing other processing, Salesforce is going to treat every flow and subflow as one compiled call, and you're going to hit your API limit of DML statements really quick. So it will get killed in saying I think the error is usually around you've exceeded DML statements is usually the error you'll see.
All right, we're good to go.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Good questions, guys. Excellent. So, right, so here's where we take our new value, our new S-object variable, our new little record that we have in memory, and we're going to save it to our virtual list that's still in memory. Okay, so now we get into the other function of this loop, okay? So it says, the typical one is review all the items in the collections till you get to the last record, right? So this one is really, so I'm going to ask Jen a question here. So here's my joke, right? So there's a guy named Pete and his twin brother, Repeat. We're on a boat, and Pete fell off. Who was left, Jen?
I'm not falling for this. No, Repeat.
Repeat. So Pete and Repeat were on a boat, and Pete fell off. Who was left? Repeat. And we repeat. Haha, it's repeat, right? We're just repeating. So that's what the loop element is. If you have 50 to 1,000 records in this collection, this loop element is going to know when it gets to the end of the records. So it's going to repeat this process until it gets to the end of the loop. So that's really the other function of what this loop element is. So it knows you have 50 records, and it's going to keep count of them. This is really great because in the coding world, you have to keep track of it yourself. You have to do your n+1 type counting, right? So you have to know, okay, here's my collection object, it has X many, and I'm going to count through it. The loop itself takes care of that for you. It encapsulates it. So it goes, I know you have a list of 20, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to do this 20 times, and when I'm done, I get to my last record, I'm going to exit out and we're going to move on. So that is the last little bit of what this loop function does.
We got a question. What happens when you get to 1001?
1001, if that collection is still part of your, if you have 1001 records, it's going to do 1001, and then it's going to end and go, okay, I know here's your last record, and I'm going to start processing, post-processing, right? So I'm going to go out of the loop, and then I'm going to move on to your other logic. Hopefully that answers your question. Let me see.
Is there a max number of records?
Well, now you're getting into the heap size. And Rakesh, you probably know more about me on this one. The heap size, I think, is 6 megs or 6 gigs within Flow. So that basically means the number of records, which is 2K per record, depending, that's the minimum. And so if you have 2K into 6 megs, how many records is that? So I would probably say that's your maximum of what Salesforce can hold in memory when you're doing this type of loop.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know we just had a follow-up answer, I guess, by Parker, and he mentioned the 2,000 element. You can only execute 2,000 elements in a single flow. So I think that there might be some differences.
Right. So this is going to be every element. Right. So every one of these is an element. So I guess that would actually hit your limit as well. Is if you had, so we have 5 elements here. So if you had, basically roughly, over 2,000 records within a loop, it's going to hit this element, twice, right? So you're going to probably hit this only out of 1,000 times. I guess that would be, you would be hitting 1,000 elements, because every time it has to process this, each one of these, every record that comes into each one of these is one element it uses. But that's a good question, Parker, on that one. So I wonder if that would be around a 2,000 count. I'd probably even say less than that, because you have to do 2, so maybe 1,000 records. I've never kind of run into that, but yeah, that's interesting. Parker is, yeah, so I guess that would be kind of maybe your limit is around, I would probably guess about 1,000 within the Salesforce. And then I guess we have a link here that someone posted about the guide to admin limits. So theoretically, it, I guess, depends on heap size as well as the number of elements. So I would probably say safely, if you're kind of building this, if you have anything more than 1,000, you might start getting into limits, because you're going to be hitting the 2,000 limit on that one. Haven't hit that yet of going through that, but that's a great question. All right, so let's move on. So now we're going to write to our database. So after the loop, so after you get to your 1,001 elements, it's all now still in memory, right? Because that's still, we haven't done anything, or we haven't done a DML operation, a data manipulation operation, which is a create, update, or delete, right? Those are our DML type statements. It's all been in memory. So now we have to commit it to the database. And that's what we're going to do. So this step, again, is not mandatory to do after, but your custom logic will determine what it is. And this is where we have to use our fast creates, or fast updates, or fast deletes. So within this here, I'm going to actually kind of switch back, and I'm going to kind of show you how this actually works and kind of run, right? So I have here a quick Easter egg shortcut. So if I actually reset my goal, so in my testing, this is what I do. right? So I did a reset. I have a process builder that looks at reset and it does a quick delete. So I actually do a quick run through. I delete everything that's attached to this and I reset it, right? So now if I want to populate, I have a populate. What we're going to do is we're going to take it. That process is going to run. It worked. And notice it copied and created them. So let's actually take a look at this flow, right? So as you can see here, it looks very standard, or it looks very like this one, okay? Again, we take a look at the prerequisites. It's exactly what it is. And here are my fields. One of the key things that you will get a lot, and this is part of debugging, is if you don't add the field here down to this list and you try and output it on a screen, you're going to get a exception error, a null exception error, because it hasn't been set, right? So be sure you add whatever fields you want to see and manipulate. It's always going to be on your collection, right? So you're going to have to add the actual fields upon your collection, right? We do our loop process. We loop through everything. We set things, and we create it, okay? And here, I'm actually going to look at my next one. So this is where we start looking at to debugs, right? We're going to look at specific ideas. Now, part of the creation, I still have the same elements. Here is where I added a counter, right? And I do a debug statement here. And I added an assignment rule up here. And this is my debug start. There is an article I remember reading out there somewhere that someone posted that best practices always include this initial debug start element, because when I'm coding, I actually hard code the actual URL of my Sherpa goal, right, and my goal, right? So I don't have to run my process builder. I don't have to actually do that action I did in the real system. I'm debugging from my start here, right? So this is I'm setting my input variables, okay? And let's take a look at that. So what is an input variable? Before it, I was a bit slow, and I couldn't figure out where this like input output here. Let's open up my goal. So in relation, so hopefully, maybe if we can raise hands, how many people have created a process builder that have called a flow? Okay, raise your hand in there, right? In doing that, you have these things that pop up on the below that give you, says, hey, input this. That is your input variables. If you set a variable in your flow to inputs, it's going to show up and be available to you in your process builder, right? This is your gateway into and out of working with the other tools of Salesforce, right? So the process builder is going to look at this flow, and any variable that has input will show up as a variable, okay? A lot of people in the things, they always say, just use input and output, right? The input and output will, so even if you don't use it, it's going to show up in your process builder, and that's a little confusing. It's like, well, do I need to put a variable there? Can I leave it blank? Like, I don't know. So that's what this is input variables give you, or when you call an apex, that's going to be the variables that these are going to be insert of what you're expecting, okay? That's your input. Output is just the inverse. When my flow is done, it's going to expect something to give to something else, right? It's the handoff, right? It's the baton, right? So you can set this collection. Let's say you're doing a collection and this is a subflow and you want to give that collection to another flow. Well, that would be an output. We would create our current S object collection of new milestones, right? Right now it's private, so it doesn't do anything. It's a variable internally into itself. There's no input and there's no output. It's localized. Okay, but if I say output, then that means I can now give it over to another flow that called me, right? I can give it, it's the handoff. So that's what input and output does. So I always start with this one. Okay, and what we're going to do is I'm actually going to run this, and we're going to take a look at how this debugs, right? Notice I had a decision point. This is actually my debug in loop. Okay, so I name my screens. I'm within the loop. I go, okay, great. Here's my loop temp name. This is a label, and this is that I'm actually pulling dynamically. What is that loop temp S object, right? So I name. Here's my parent. my prerequisite. Okay, that's what it is, right? And here's my ID, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. All right, so this is my tracking of when I'm actually in the loop, right? So I'm kind of going in here, and I'm looking at this one. This is the screen I got. Now, I put a counter here because I don't know, sometimes you might have that list of 1,000. Well, you don't want to click next 1,000 times just to kind of reprocess it, right? So I created my own counter, right? I created my counter, and basically I have var counter is less than 3, right? So I'm only going to go through this 3 times before it basically goes, oh, sorry, I'm just going to set my stuff and move on, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to go next one, right? So it's my PR03. It's still the prerequisite for the top parent. Cool, right? Now, it exits out. Now, here's the key thing, and actually I caught myself because I was like, I wanted to look at to see if my new variables, my new collection was created, right? Was there, because in my flow, okay, well, I'm assigning everything here, so I'm assigning to my new collection, everything's there, and this is actually where I, on this post process, this is where I add one to my counter. So this is actually how in this little code part of how I increment my variable, right? So in my last assignment step, I increment, I just say add 1, right? I don't want to say equals 1 because it would always be 1, so we add, right? So it's kind of cool. It knows the number and it could add or subtract, which is very cool, right? So I add my milestone to my new milestone. And I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, okay, well, I should have my IDs, right? And I'm a little embarrassed to say this. It took me a day and a half to figure out why I didn't have my variables, because look, like, I should have a list of variables. So I'm going to ask Rakesh, so hopefully he's going to say, he's going to know the issue, because I know it, I feel like you're more of a developer. So why don't I have my IDs here, Rakesh? If you're on mute, you might need to unmute yourself. Or he could have just left. But anyway, or if someone goes, oh, I know, I should probably ask Parker. But oh, who just came on? All right, so do you remember what happens when we write things to the database? That is when we get the IDs. We're still in memory, right? So I haven't written anything yet to the database. So therefore, my collection doesn't have any IDs at all. And it finally dawned on me the other day. I'm like, oh, that's right. So we're right here in this first step, or this first screen, right? So this is my debug, right? So I always do a little title of all my screens so I know where I am in the code. Debug after the loop before create of the new milestone collections. And sure enough, I have my element, I have a whole bunch of commas, but all the IDs are blank. But now if we go next, oh, look at that. Now I have my debug create of the new milestone collection, right? So it's after my create. Oh, look, now it actually gets IDs. Go figure. So, and sure enough, if we actually go back and we do a refresh of our milestone, oh, that record's been deleted. Let me go back to, that was the goal. I want the goal. There we go. Refresh, right? So I didn't do a delete before. I should see, right? So now I actually have them, right? So if I go back and actually take a look at this, at this record, and we copy this ID, this is our favorite, right? And this little part's going to go away when we start using Lightning, because we're going to take a variable, put it in our URL, hit enter, and there we go, right? So these are the actual milestones that have been created for that little test record, right, through my little loop. Right, and then of course that's the end of our loop, and that's our finish, right? So that's really kind of the debugging step of how we kind of look at, okay, well, what of our variables within our flow, right, or in our loop, because of the fact of, okay, hopefully I'm assigning things correctly. And it's always weird, like notice my counter was, it only did it twice, right? So it's like, how come it, it's that one off, right? When you always have that, you always have to do the first check the first one, be sure it enters at that first one, and always be sure you get that last one, because sometimes my counters, you know, I set it to 0 or I set it to 1, right? And depending on my counter loop, if I have a decision, you know, if I say less than 3, oh, well, that only does twice. Oh, right. So I actually needed to go through less than or equal to 3, right, to actually see the third, right? So that's kind of the, you know, how we start to debug, and you put these, you know, screen elements within there to do your breaks and kind of see what your variables are. Okay.
There is a question out there for you to show the screen debug that displays the collection IDs.
Oh, yes. There you go. That's all it is. If you're actually just listing, you're just calling the collection variable. And that because a collection, that's all it has. So this, it doesn't show you all the elements or all the fields. It only shows you the actual IDs of the collection, right? So it's a little weird. It's not like a normal array. It doesn't output all the fields of the records. It just shows you their IDs. So that's all I do. So I'm just calling my collection variable, and I'm doing an output to be sure that they're there. So there you go. Great question. I was wondering if there's anything else. Yeah, no. And then that's my debug of where I do. So yeah. Okay, perfect. Let's see here if there's any other last. Right. So in summary, we're going to take a look at the 5 characteristics of loop and start this all over again. Now, a little loop humor for you. Yeah, so that's pretty much the end of kind of the examples of hopefully looking at this deep dive, right? So the elements and being able to look at these items. So if you take a look on, if you do a search, I'll probably do this maybe on the, there is an automation hour group, right, Jen?
Yes, Salesforce Automation Hour.
Yes. So I will do a link to actually my, I did a loop cheat sheet that basically kind of breaks down exactly what I talked about, each element, what it kind of goes through, and also some of the naming conventions. If you do a search out there of loop cheat sheet, you should be able to find it. I think it's within the top 10, but it's a file, it's a PDF that I created. One was primarily for selfish reasons because of the fact that I couldn't remember myself, and I like to write things down and, you know, might as well share it with the world after I did that. So hopefully that we have 10 minutes left. I guess we kind of open it to other additional question and answers about anything else. So yeah, so I guess I'll turn it back to you, Jen.
Sure. If folks have any other questions, please post that to the question section. I also want to tell you, Pete, personally, I found this fairly helpful because I recently did looping, and I got hung up on the whole collection and which was the variable and whatnot. So if I had attended this sooner, it would have solved my problems.
Well, actually, I know. It was really hard for me. Like, I was like, I got to be kidding. You're creating 5 different variables just to do this one thing, and I got so confused.
Exactly.
With like,
exactly.
what was it? And that's when I kind of came up with this naming convention. And okay, and this is part of programmatic Apex, right? They come up with naming conventions, and you kind of have to use it. It's a good tool, and they kind of do that. So hopefully, you know, some other ones out there, you know, will learn from this and not be so scared of it. So thank you.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Last call for any additional questions related to Pete's presentation or any process automation questions in general. Give a couple of seconds for someone to type. We got to thank you so much from Corey.
Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome, Corey. Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay, so I do not see any other questions or feedback. So thank you so much. Wonderful knowledge. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you so much, Pete, for this. I'm sure once we post the recording that people will just go back and reference it as they work through their first loop. So that wraps up our automation hour, and we'll see you next time on the 10th. Have a great weekend.